My first speaker today is Miko Peled. Miko is considered by many to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine. Support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights in all historic Palestine. Miko is also a contributor to several online publications and has been invited to speak all over the world. Wherever he is speaking, Miko dedicates the opportunity to advocate for the creation of one democratic state with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. He travels regularly to Palestine, where he speaks and works with Popular Resistance, the BDS movement, and other justice groups. He is the author of 2 books, The General's Son. They're both up here, by the way, guys. Please come and take a look at it. And the General's Son, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine and Injustice, Injustices, the Story of the Holy Land 5 Foundation. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Miko before I continue to stumble on my words.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Nice to see everyone here. Good to be with you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this to speak at this gathering. You know, I was introduced to this issue of the victims of the war on terror completely by mistake, or by chance, I should say. And that was when in 2012 I was in Dallas speaking about my first book that had just come out, and in the audience were some of the daughters of the Holy Land Foundation 5, and they came up to me and told me the story. And initially, when I heard the story, and Nida's here, right? Where's Nida? There she is. What are the daughters? She's outside? Okay. Anyway, initially when I heard the story of this relief organization, Muslim relief organization, run by Palestinians, and the unbelievable injustice that they had faced, I thought it was unbelievable. I mean, literally, I didn't believe it. I didn't think they were lying, but it just seemed unbelievable, because in America you expect that the justice system is clean, is not corruptible, and that if you're innocent, then you know most of the time you're going to get a fair shot, a fair trial. And then you know I was curious, because obviously you know the story that they were telling me was a compelling one. And then I heard more and more and more, and I received more and more information. Their appeal had just been denied, and the story that was unfolding was really unbelievable, but one that I felt very strongly had to be told. And then one day, when I knew enough, I decided I have to write this book. I have to write about the story, and I called it Injustice, because that's really what it is. I was really fortunate, because the families of the Holy Land Foundation 5 were generous and wanting to work together and willing to help, and hosted me, and it was really a good experience in that regard, as sad as it was. And the 5, I didn't meet all 5, but I met 4 of the 5 in prison, and it was an education for me, as someone who has always lived on the privileged side of what is a unjust, really racist system here in America, and also growing up as an Israeli in Palestine. There are a lot of similarities. Growing up on the privileged side, you don't know, very often you can't even begin to imagine what it's like when you're on the other side of that reality. And when I got deeper and deeper into the story of the Holy Land Foundation, I began talking to other people about it, because you want to tell people. Of course, most of the people around me were like me, white, privileged Americans. And nobody believed it. At the end of every conversation, there was somebody saying, yes, but they must have done something. Yes, but they must have done something. Well, they did a lot of things, but they were all good. They did absolutely nothing, nothing to even remotely justify being indicted. Certainly not the horrendous trials that they had to go through. And then when we started the tour for the book, the title was something about the injustice within, something about that described the injustice as something that is unique, that's really different. And the realization I came to was that it is only unique and only strange if you're white and privileged in America. If you are a member of any minority, if you're a person of color, then that is the reality in which you live. That is the reality. The injustice is a reality. Expecting justice is absurd. And of course, that's even harder for most people to hear. For most people, most privileged people, it's even harder to hear, because privileged people don't usually like to hear that they're privileged for some reason. So that was my introduction to this world of the victims of the war and terror. And over the years, I met Sami Larayan and Lina and everybody that's involved in this excellent organization, and some of the other families who've been involved in this. And I think a lot of times there's not a real appreciation for how systemic this issue is, how systemic the problem is, and how far-reaching it is. So I think, I expect some of you at least know that in the trial of the Holy Land Foundation 5, they brought as expert witnesses two Israeli intelligence officers that testified anonymously. Now that is so horrifying on so many levels, but why is Israel involved in this at all? And then, once again, my main focus was this particular story, and I started talking to people who worked for Holy Land Foundation in Palestine, Palestinians, and what they had gone through, and what you saw was this collaboration between the Israeli authorities and the American authorities. So one particular gentleman who managed the office in Jerusalem, his name was Mohammed Anati, he was tortured and interrogated by the Israelis, and then the FBI came and offered him American citizenship if he worked with them. And you start to wonder, what is going on here? What is this strange collaboration, and how did these people get in the middle of this? Because these are two powers that are really, what is behind all this? What is it they're looking for? I think that Israel is much more involved in the suffering of American Muslims and Arabs than people appreciate. Israeli and pro-Israeli organizations, and it's not a conspiracy theory. This is grounded in the reality. There are countless of pro-Israeli organizations with all kinds of different names that in every single state, in every single county, that are dedicated to pursuing this very racist, very supremacist agenda which serves Israel. And they are always at least 10 years ahead of everybody else. And the reason they're 10 years ahead of everybody else, and the reason they work so hard, is because they are worried that if there are any chinks in their armor, they're going down. The whole story collapses. The entire story of Israel is built on a lie. It's built on a myth. It's built on this lie that there's no such thing as Palestine, that there are no Palestinians, that 2,000 years ago there was a tribe called the Hebrews, and people like myself today are descendants of that tribe, and that between 2,000 years ago and 1948, really nothing significant happened in Palestine. And it's incredible that they were successful in pushing this narrative forward to a point where when you talk to people, educated people, that's what they know. That's what they'll tell you. Palestine? They go, what, Pakistan? You know, how can you be so? How can people be so ignorant when we're talking about the history, a rich, important history of this place, which is really a really important strategic intersection of you know, the Eastern Mediterranean. But they have to pursue this agenda. They have to pursue this narrative, because otherwise there's no legitimacy to the whole story of Israel. The whole story of Israel says that people like myself, who are descendants of that tribe, are back. And you know, wow, look at that, isn't that incredible? And again, that nothing of significance, and the people that were there were of no significance. And the people that were there were Palestinians, mostly Muslims, who had a country that was rich, who had a history that was rich, a culture that was rich, and it was all wiped out and forgotten. Now, what the Holy Land Foundation did, which I think is applicable to a lot of people who got, you know, caught up in this war on terror, they didn't think they were doing anything political, although there were certainly people who had strong political beliefs. But they were dealing with relief, and they were promoting a relief organization. And they were doing a very good job, and they were demonstrating, they were showing what was happening to Palestinians, mostly in refugee camps, in Palestine and around Palestine. And some of these pro-Israel organizations that are out there noticed that they were doing a very good job in portraying the reality in Palestine, albeit through a, you know, a relief kind of, you know, charity perspective. And they found that to be dangerous. In other words, even a relief organization that is just demonstrating why there's a need for relief posed a threat to this Israeli narrative, to the Zionist narrative. Because when you see the work that they did, of course they did really important work. And for a small, relatively small organization, they did incredible work. And when they were closed down, you could see there were reports that were showing how they were sorely missed on the ground in refugee camps. But the problem was that when they demonstrated, when they were showing what is taking place in Palestine, the reality in refugee camps, the poverty, the need for basic things, and the reality they were portraying is a 5-minute drive from Israeli cities and towns where people live like this, where there's no such thing as no electricity, there's no such thing as no clean water. There's no such thing as paved, you know, roads that are not paved, and people who are poor and need assistance. There's no such thing. Israeli standard of living is very high, if you're an Israeli Jew. And that's why they had to be taken down, because they were presenting, what they were presenting was a threat to the Israeli narrative. Now you expand on that. Now they were, of course, you know, they were Palestinians. They were, you know, so that was part of the problem. But now they've expanded. You know, they found the need to expand the net. You can't just deal with Palestinians. That's not enough. You have to deal with other Muslims. You have to create this impression that Muslims are a threat. And what are they a threat to? They're a threat to this wonderful thing called Israel. And if they're a threat to Israel, which is an important ally for America, then they're a threat to Americans. And by the way, look at terrorism, and look at 9/11, and look at this, and of course it's all Muslims, and it's all, you know, these dangerous people. And they were very successfully through this really well-run network of organizations, mostly NGOs, you know, perpetuate the story and convince people that the problem is Muslims, the problem is Arabs, the problem is Palestinians, but not only Palestinians. And then you have this reality where you have, you know, an entire community, or communities, I should say, here in America, that are impacted by this thing that had absolutely nothing to do with. That had absolutely nothing to do with. So Israel is key to this story. Israel and this very odd relationship between Israel and the United States are key to the story. So I think it's important to understand it. It's important to see it in the, read between the lines and see Israel's intervention in all this, and then to get people to talk about this. This book, Injustice, people are scared to read it and scared to give it to other people. I'm talking about people within the Muslim and Arab community are afraid to have a presentation. They're afraid to have it, to promote it, which I respect. But it just shows you just how deep seated this problem is. So the question is, what do we do with this? I mean, this is a horrifying reality. I mean, people being thrown in prison and people who have done nothing wrong. Again, going back to the Holy Land Foundation, two of them, Shukri Abu Bakr and Hassan Elashi, are in for 65 years. When I told people in Palestine, people who worked with the Holy Land Foundation, that it was 65 years, they didn't believe me. People didn't believe me when I told them it was 65 years. I'd say it in Arabic, I'd say it in English, I'd say it in any language they want. They could understand. People did not believe me that these guys got 65 years, even 20 years. But the reality is that they had to be taken down. And they had to be taken down, and they were made an example, so that people would be afraid to deal with Palestine. People would be afraid to, as Muslims, as Arabs, to talk about Palestine. And of course, this had a huge impact. And the only beneficiaries, of course, are Israel. The only beneficiaries are the pro-Israeli organizations that have been promoting these lies from the very, very beginning. You may have heard, thank you. You may have heard of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. They present themselves, I mean, of course, I've known about them for years, but I mean, they present themselves as some kind of a, civil rights organization. In many communities in America, you see Muslims and Arabs working closely with them. And there was a campaign about a year ago, Drop the ADL. It's madness. They're not a civil rights organization. They are a racist, pro-violence, pro-Israel organization. Anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim organization. Civil rights are the absolute last thing on their mind. They promote the lies, they promote the violence, they justify the violence against Palestinians. They justify, certainly, they were key, they were absolutely key in the taking down of the Holy Land Foundation. Key in taking down the Holy Land Foundation. They began early on, in the early 90s. They began spreading lies about the Holy Land and Shukri and some of the others. But, the head of the ADL gets to sit with the president and gets to sit with people in Congress and gets to meet the Pope. And I mean, these guys walk around like they're really, really important and influential. And they are influential. But it's important for people to know that what they say they are, that they're basically lying. And that nobody should work with them or sit next to them. And of course, there are other, again, you couldn't begin to count the number of pro-Israeli organizations that are out there in every community, in every state, working extremely hard and extremely well funded in order to pursue this agenda of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian here in America. Because to them, this is key. To them, as long as Muslims are bad, Arabs are bad, and certainly Palestinians are bad and they're terrorists and should be suspected, then they're always going to be seen as the good guys. And Israel just had elections. And when you look at the Israeli government is made of a coalition. When you look at the people who are going to be sitting in this coalition government, this time around, we were just talking about this, Palestinians are going to be looking at what is happening today, and this year was a record year in number of Palestinians being killed. Palestinians are going to look at this year as the good old days. It is that severe. And at the same time, most people that I know would not say the things that I've just been saying because they don't want to be called anti-Semitic. And you may have heard in Montgomery County here near DC, there was a campaign now to adopt this new definition of anti-Semitism. Have you heard of this new definition of anti-Semitism? It's called the IHRA, and it's, it just happened to be that in Montgomery County they just adopted it. So you have to wonder, why do you need a new definition of anti-Semitism? I mean, anti-Semitism, this definition has been around forever. It means racism that targets Jewish people. In this definition, and they call it a non-binding definition, so it's just a working definition. And they've got examples of what constitutes anti-Semitism. And in these examples, Israel is mentioned 7 times. Why is Israel even really connected to this? They've tied it together. So if you criticize, oppose, or God forbid, like I do, completely reject Israel's legitimacy, then you must be anti-Semitic. And it's basically a fear campaign. It's a way to terrorize people so that they don't say all the things that I just said here. And they passed it. Why does Montgomery County have to pass it? Well, they passed it. There's obviously some political pressure. There's always some pro-Israel organization that's, has influence and knows people, and they get it done. And a big part of the problem that there's nobody on the other side, there's nobody on our side, so to speak, that is as well organized, well funded, well connected as they are. And they're very good at it. The Israelis have been at it since, for more than 100 years, before Israel was established. And there's nobody on this side that's promoting the Palestinian issue. There's nobody on this side that's promoting the Arab and the Muslim story in a way that could match what they're doing. And it's all, and people say, oh, it's anti-Semitic, it's a conspiracy theory. It's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism, it's got nothing to do with Jews, it's got nothing to do with conspiracies. It's the state of Israel. It's the pro-Israel organizations in the U.S., everything from AIPAC down to, every other organization. There's the Jewish Federation, there's all these organizations, and they usually have the Jewish as part of their name. Because if you're Jewish, of course, nobody's going to touch you, God forbid. But it's not about being Jewish. It's got nothing to do with Jewish people. And criticizing this and standing up against it has got nothing to do with Jewish people. And I'll end with just one story maybe to illustrate how far removed what Israel is and what Israel done is from what it means to be Jewish. So I'm working on a book, I've been working on a book for a couple of years now about this Jewish community, ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, which has been historically anti-Zionist and stood up against Israel. You may have seen them in protests. These are the real rabbis, with all the clothes and the beards, and they stand at, all these protests against Israel with Palestinians. And I had to wonder myself, what are they talking about? And I grew up in Jerusalem, and they were the next neighborhood over was these people, these ultra-Orthodox Jews, who would burn the Israeli flag. And there was a book that came out, this is something I learned recently, a book that came out in the year 1900. In the year 1900, Zionism had just begun. This whole idea of Israel, of a Jewish state in Palestine, was completely new. And the rabbis around the world were concerned. So they published a book to warn Jewish people from the dangers of this idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, which is, by the way, completely rejected by Jewish people and goes against Jewish law. Because according to Jewish law, Jews are prohibited from sovereignty in the Holy Land. And in this book, they basically said there were 3 things that Jews had to watch out for. And again, this book was warning Jews about the dangers of this idea of a Jewish state. And they said, the first thing they said was, it would bring violence to the Holy Land. The second thing they said was, it will ruin the good relations between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs around the world. And the third thing they said was that it would cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jewish people. Because are you an American or are you an Israeli? Where's your loyalty? And God forbid, that's one of the examples of anti-Semitism now. But Jewish people historically had good relations with Muslims, had good relations with Arabs, Jews. When you talk to Jewish people who lived in Palestine or other parts of the Middle East, of course, they all had very good relations with their neighbors. Until Zionism came, until the State of Israel came. So again, I'll just say this has nothing to do, criticizing Israel and talking about the role of Israel in this war on terror, which is really not a war on terror, it's a war on Islam, it's a war on Arabs, and it's a war on Palestinians. It has nothing to do with Jewish people. It has nothing to do with Judaism. And so, as hard as it is, I would encourage people to talk to their elected officials, to talk to school board members, to talk to city council members, to talk to local counties, and explain to them, what I've been talking about right now, because they don't know, and if they don't hear from this community, they're not going to know. So anyway, thank you very much for listening.